What would happen if the most powerful country in the world suddenly lost all of its power? We saw how America's early 20th century divisions stopped it from becoming a superpower. Now, in episode 2, we're jumping into the chaos of World War II, a war where the US sits on the sidelines. A new powers rise from the ashes. What happens when America misses its chance to shape history? Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and let's time warp into a world redefined by war. It's 1939, and the world is on fire. World War II erupts as Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan carve up Europe and Asia. In our timeline, the United States became the arsenal of democracy, building ships, planes, and tanks to turn the tide for the Allies. But in this alternate history, the US is a fractured nation, crippled by isolationism and internal strife, the divisions we saw in episode 1, state rivalries. Economic stagnation have left America too weak to lead. So, what happens when the world's biggest potential player stays out of the game? In our timeline, America joined the war after Pearl Harbor, bringing with it an overwhelming industrial and economic force. Within 2 years, American factories were producing 75% of all the aluminum, 50% of all the steel, 35% of all the gasoline needed by the Allies. By war's end, US factories produced 63,000 aircraft, 88,000 motor vehicles, 14 million tons of steel, and 23 million tons of aluminum for the war effort. These staggering numbers give you an idea of the difference between our timeline and this one. In this timeline, America builds planes, just not very many. Maybe they produce the 100 or so planes that will be delivered to China before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and maybe a few others are sent to Britain. But that's it. It's basically a symbolic gesture. The reason for this production difference is simple. In our timeline, the US had a federal government capable of directing national resources to the war effort. Here, the central government is weak and corrupt, and it lacks the mechanisms for effectively mobilizing the nation for war. Most of the country's raw materials are controlled by state governments. All of those laws passed in episode 1, preventing the export of natural resources, well, they come in handy for states like Texas, which can now sell oil only to their neighbors. Or how about California, which holds on to its stockpile of aluminum, a vital resource for building planes and munitions. Without the power to mobilize on a national scale, America fails to step up and fill the void left by the European powers. And this failure has huge repercussions for the war. After France falls in 1940, Britain stands alone against the Nazis. In our timeline, the US sent weapons, tanks, food, medicine, ammunition, planes, ships, and soldiers to help Great Britain survive the Blitz. President Franklin Roosevelt recognized the importance of the fight against fascism and convinced Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act. This act allowed the president to lend or lease any defense article to any country he deemed vital to the defense of the United States. This program poured much-needed resources into Britain, allowing them to continue fighting. Without the US's financial support, however, Britain's economy, they simply don't have the resources to keep up the fight. For months, Churchill considered the possibility of evacuating Britain entirely, abandoning his homeland and taking the war into exile. Eventually, though, cooler heads prevailed. Britain might fall, but they're going to do it on their own terms. In March 1941, Britain finally accepted the seemingly inevitable. As German troops rolled across the Channel, Winston Churchill announced to Parliament, "We shall go on fighting and fighting and fighting until in God's good time the new world with the aid of the old shall once more set Europe at liberty and bring our world back to peace." 3 weeks later, Germany declared war on the US. Britain was right. America did come to the rescue, but not in the way they expected. In our timeline, America provided over 50% of the war material used by the British during the war. In this timeline, Britain receives a few hundred planes and a couple dozen ships and tanks, not enough to tip the scales, but perhaps enough to delay the inevitable by a year or so. Now, China's story is a little different. In our timeline, China fought a brutal war with Japan, suffering tremendous casualties and being forced deep into the countryside. The US provided vital aid, including the Flying Tigers, a group of American pilots who helped Chinese fighters take on the Japanese. Without American help, China loses the war against Japan. But here's the twist. In this timeline, a more organized nationalist government in China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, avoids collapse. They've been weakened by infighting and corruption in our timeline. Here they are stronger and better prepared. They receive aid from the Soviet Union, and with a more unified command, the Chinese war machine starts churning out more equipment, training more soldiers, and pushing back the Japanese. While China still suffers heavy losses, it doesn't lose the war. By late 1945, both Japan and Germany are defeated. But the Allied victory is bloodier and more drawn out. The Soviet Union and China emerge as the war's victors. Moscow celebrates with a massive parade down the Champs. The Chinese troops march through the streets of Nanjing to cheers from crowds of civilians. A new era dawns, and it doesn't include the United States. As the dust settles, the world looks to its victors for leadership. But here's the problem. Neither the Soviet Union nor China is interested in leading. The Soviet Union wants buffer zones between itself and Europe. That means controlling the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, and Belarus. As for China, it seeks to reunify with Chinese-speaking regions around the world: Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. These two superpowers are focused on security and reunification, not leadership. And besides, the damage done to their economies during the war means that they are not in a position to fund foreign operations anyway. Who steps in to fill this vacuum? Well, no one. The US isn't interested in shaping the post-war world. In fact, it doesn't even want to leave its continent. So we're left with a scenario that seems almost inconceivable today. A world where no major power wants to be the leader of the free world. So how does this fractured America survive? The answer, it kind of doesn't. Sure, it holds elections, it grows crops, raises families, and drives Model Ts. The US is technically alive, but it's not exactly thriving. Politically, the country is split in two spheres, each dominated by a hegemonic power. Western states align themselves with the Soviet sphere, while Eastern states join China's. Some states, like Texas and California, maintain some autonomy. But for the most part, America is now a collection of client states. Economically, the country is in sharp decline. Without the unifying force of war, the internal squabbling continues. The agricultural and industrial interests remain at odds. Farmers want cheap transportation to deliver their goods to market. Factory owners want cheap energy to power their machines. Both groups are willing to sacrifice the other's interests, but no one is willing to compromise. The result is a stagnant economy that fails to grow. As the rest of the world rebuilds, the US sinks deeper into mediocrity. Culturally, America remains diverse. People still immigrate to the United States seeking new lives, but opportunities are few and far between. Those immigrants wind up working low-paying jobs in small towns, unable to move to larger cities because of restrictive state policies. The melting pot cools down to a simmer. The US military, cut off from the vast resources of the federal government, is woefully It's a force of a few 100,000 men spread thinly across the continent. With insufficient training and equipment, The US military becomes a symbolic force with little real power. So what does this mean for the world? Without America's post-war Marshall Plan, Europe doesn't rebuild quickly. Cities lie in ruins for decades, and nations turn to the Soviet Union for aid. In Asia, China's victory over Japan makes it a dominant force, setting the stage for its global rise. With the US out of the picture, the Soviet Union and China dominate the world. And even though they aren't interested in global leadership, they become the world's top powers anyway. The rest of the world looks to these two for guidance. The Soviet Union pushes communism, and the Chinese promote nationalism. Soon, governments around the world align themselves with one side or the other. But what about America? How does this fragmented nation survive in a world dominated by two superpowers? Well, it doesn't really. Internal squabbles continue, and the US is too weak to project power abroad. It's trapped in its own regional sphere, unable to influence events beyond its borders. As the Cold War heats up, the US finds itself caught in the middle. But to be honest, it doesn't matter much. American concerns are too localized to have any real impact. The US survives, but only in name. It's a shadow of its former self, a fading memory of what could have been. So there you have it. A world where America misses its chance at greatness. What a strange reality we'd be living in today. So what do you think? Could the US have survived without ever joining the war? And how might this have changed the outcome of the Cold War? Drop your theories in the comments below. And hey, we've got more intriguing scenarios waiting in the wings. Will the Iranian Revolution change the course of history? Can the Russian Empire defy time? How would the world look if China never fell into civil war? The possibilities are endless, and we want you to be a part of it. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of What If Time Wrap. And hey, if you're craving even more thought-provoking content, dive into our other series, like Alternate History Hub and the WWII Files.